Hello, my name is Oh Joon. I'm professor of UN Studies at Korean University, and I used to be Korean ambassador to the United Nations, during which time I also served as president of the United Nations Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC. Today I'd like to talk about sustainable development, which must be of interest to all of you, and also how youth can contribute to global sustainable development based on my experience in the United Nations. I would first like to invite you to think about the question, what is development? We use this term development quite often, but I don't know if you really think about it. Well, according to dictionary, development is a process that creates growth or progress or positive change. In other words, improving our lives. When I was a 6-year-old kid in South Korea, they started TV broadcasting by starting KBS, Korea Broadcasting Corporation. Before that, we didn't have TV, so we all listened to radio only. So the fact that we were able to enjoy TV broadcasting instead of radio must represent development. Over a certain period of time, all the households in South Korea got hold of television set. So you can say that over 10 years' time, for example, everyone has television. Isn't that development? Yes, it is. But if you look at a certain point of time, for example, because they started broadcasting in 1961, let's say in 1962, in South Korea, not every household had television. Only a few handful of rich families were able to enjoy television viewing. So a lot of other people had to wait. So what I mean is at a certain point of time, there is a gap between the haves and have-nots. So the efforts to narrow this gap existing between rich and poor are also called development. And that is actually more important to the context of development in the United Nations and other international organizations. In today's world, there are about 9% of the world population, or 700 million people, live below the level of poverty, what is called poverty line, which means that someone lives with less than $1.9 a day. So that means we still have a lot of people in extreme poverty. If you think about it, when did poverty start? When in human history, since when? Some people got richer than others, and some people got poorer than others. If you think about old days when our ancestors were living as hunters and gatherers, there must not have been people who are richer than others, because you are moving around. You don't have a lot of storage of food. You have to always eat whatever you can get. So nobody was particularly richer than others. But according to historians, around 10,000 years ago, humans settled and started farming. And then they were able to store food and resources. If you think about it, humans started farming. Humans domesticated animals. So now they have animals, livestock, like cattle, chicken, pigs. So if you have 100 chickens while others have only 10 chickens, then you are richer than others, right? Then how can someone have 100 chickens while others have only 10 chickens? Well, probably he or she must have worked harder or saved more. When others wanted to eat chicken, he or she didn't eat chicken, so saved, or innovated. You can innovate the way you raise chicken. So those who work harder, save more, and innovate has advantage in this kind of economic competition. Well, they needed market also, because when you are hunters and gatherers, your full-time job is seeking food. But once you settled, only small percentage of population doing farming can feed all the population. So some people, were able to do something else. Like you want to be a full-time dressmaker, then you are a dressmaker. You want to be a full-time shoemaker, then you are a shoemaker. But you cannot eat your shoes, so you have to trade your shoes with food. So they needed market, and they needed currency that will tell you how valuable your product is. Humans lived like that for many years, and there was already the gap between rich and poor. But when humans were working manually, mostly manually, the gap between the rich and poor, inequality, was not so big. But through industrialization, what was called the Industrial Revolution, some 300 years ago, the gap between the rich and poor, or inequality, grew dramatically, because through industrialization, compared to labor, capital and technology became more important, and that kind of exaggerated the effects of capitalism. So by 19th century, inequality was very, very big, and people couldn't afford to, live with that. The rich people were too rich, and poor people were really starving, mostly in Europe. So with this growth of inequality, some people thought, how about governments monopolizing production, and governments intervene to distribute resources to people? So instead of people having 100 chickens or 10 chickens, people only work in chicken farm. So the owner of chicken farming is government. So everyone is working on salary or wage. This idea was called communism. And as we know, communism failed. It didn't succeed. Well, we don't have time to discuss the reason why communism failed, but the way I see it, I think it was not in line with human nature. But whatever the reason, the ideas of communism and failure of communism gave lesson to market economy as well, capitalist economy. So in today's world, most countries, most economies, including advanced economies, they all have a certain aspects of government intervention. So you can say that they all have a certain aspect of socialism, even if they are not communist, So we call them mixed economy. I think all economies in the world today are mixed economies to a certain extent. In countries in Northern Europe have more socialist approaches compared to, for example, United States. But even in the United States, government intervention, mostly in the form of taxes and transfers, are there and are important elements of today's US economy. More recently, during the last several decades, we have witnessed a process called globalization. Globalization means that the world is getting smaller and more connected thanks to the dramatic developments of communication and transportation technologies. So now world is small. It's like a global village. With that, these efforts to narrow the gap between the rich and poor, most importantly through the government's state intervention to redistribute wealth among its people, these efforts are now have more challenges, faced with more challenges. Because in a globalized world, to put it simply, companies are getting, more and more companies are getting global. So we have more global companies, but there is no global government. The United Nations is not a global government. So there is nobody at the global level who can do redistribution of wealth or income through taxes and transfers. So that's one of the reasons why inequality is growing again in this globalized world, in this age of globalization. Another challenge is climate change. With the use of fossil fuel, we have been causing climate change and global warming. So that has been aggravated during the last few decades. And now we have reached a level where we should really think seriously about what we can do with it. Otherwise, we will spoil the global environment too much, and there will be no coming back, which is very dangerous situation. So these two challenges, growing inequality and climate change, are the two most serious challenges faced by humanity in the age of globalization. Now let's think about the United Nations role in sustainable development. When the UN was created in 1945, the Charter of the United Nations was established on what is called 3 pillars. 3 pillars meaning peace, human rights, and development. So as you can see, even the founders of the United Nations recognized that development is essential in promote human prosperity and human security and human well-being. Article 55 of the UN Charter says, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations, the United Nations shall promote higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. So this short paragraph, shows why the United Nations was established on 3 pillars, including development. The concept of development has evolved over the last 7 decades. In the beginning, development was mostly about economic growth. And then from around 1980s, social dimension was added because people realized that even if you achieve economic growth, even if you have fruits of economic growth, if your society, for example, people are not enjoying gender equality, for example, and all the fruits of economic growth go to men and boys, and women and girls are still poor, then you really cannot call it real development. So without social development, economic development is not enough. So social dimension was added. And then by the late 1990s, we got to realize that climate change is being caused by human activities, and we need to take the environmental dimension into account. So that kind of constituted what is called 3 dimensions of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental dimensions. In year 2000, the United Nations adopted what is called the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs. Millennium Development Goals had 8 goals, mostly for social development, including some goals for public health. The Millennium Development Goals contributed to the promotion of human development, especially in some areas, such as poverty reduction, public health, and education. But it was more or less too much focused on social development, so there was not much of balance among the so-called 3 dimensions of development. Economic and environmental dimensions were kind of left out. So they thought they need, when MDGs were expiring in 2015, so before that, the international community tried to work out a new set of development goals that would start from 2016. So this time around, they considered the achievements and limitations of MDGs, as well as what was called emerging new challenges. And as I said, 2 of them are most important: growing inequality and climate change. So they took all of them into account, and they worked out what was called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. In 2015, in September, the world leaders got together in the United Nations for a special summit meeting, and they adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which contained the SDGs. The SDGs have 17 goals, much more than the MDGs, which only had 8 goals. So you can say that the SDGs are more comprehensive just by comparing the numbers of the goals. You can realize that. But other than that, SDGs have some important characteristics. First of all, it is universal, universality. Universal means that SDGs are for both developing countries and developed countries. If you look at these 17 goals, you realize that some goals, for example, reducing inequality, SDG 10, climate action, SDG 13, these goals are more important in a way for developed countries, because it is the developed countries that have to take action to reduce carbon emissions and to take more action to deal with climate change, for example. So that's why we call the SDGs universal. They are not just for developing countries, but for everyone, including developed economies. A overarching principle for the SDGs is no one will be left behind, or we sometimes say, leaving no one behind. This is a principle to make sure that when achieving the SDGs, we need to first take care of the most vulnerable groups in our society, such as women, children, persons with disabilities, migrant workers. So these people are vulnerable groups in any society. So if these vulnerable people are taken care of, then the whole of society will be naturally, lifted when it comes to the efforts for development. There are some other characteristics, including SDGs have follow-up and review mechanism, whereas MDGs didn't. Also, SDGs are to be implemented by multi-stakeholder partnership, which means that the government is no longer the only player when it comes to development cooperation. There are other players like the private sector, civil society. They are all playing more and more important roles in development cooperation. Let's also think about the world in this pandemic year. The whole world is now being affected by COVID-19 pandemic. So when we are talking about development, we cannot do that without taking into account the impact of the pandemic, global pandemic. The United Nations Secretary General said the world faces the most challenging crisis since World War II, confronting a pandemic, threatening people in every country that will bring a recession that probably has no parallel in the recent past. And actually he said this last year, but the crisis is still going on. Well, I'd like to give you kind of 5 keywords to think about in trying to, analyze what's going on and what would be the impact of this pandemic crisis. 2 short-term keywords are global public health crisis and economic depression. And 3 long-term keywords are US-China rivalry, confrontation between globalism and nationalism, and dispute over state-centered and people-centered approach. First keyword, global public health crisis. We don't need any explanation to understand that this is the biggest public health crisis in our generation, in our lifetime. When what is called Spanish flu crisis occurred, that was 100 years ago. So we were not around that time. So this is the biggest crisis in our generation. At the moment when I'm talking, we have close to 100 million confirmed cases in the world and more than 2 million deaths in the world. The second keyword, global economic depression. We have kind of cyclical, regular global economic recessions almost every 10 years. But when recession is really, really bad, we sometimes call it depression. There was what was called global depression in 1929. And nobody knows whether this economic recession will be as bad as that. But last year, 2020, the global economy contracted by 4 to 5%. We don't have the final statistics yet, but the IMF's prediction that was revised last time was minus 4.4% for the world. And to varying degrees, all the major economies in the world are suffering, mostly negative growth. But what is more serious than the recession is the fact that inequality is now being exacerbated. Inequality has always been growing, at least during the last several decades, but this kind of global crisis is making it worse. And in this post-pandemic world, there is this question that whether the so-called fourth industrial revolution technologies would contribute to increasing or decreasing inequality. There was a lot of debate, but going through this pandemic crisis, at least I think, these new technologies are not helping, reducing inequality. On the other hand, inequality might even further grow if you think about, for example, let's say we have robots that will help our daily life. Do you think robots will be available to everyone in the world, or only rich people first? If you think about it, you would understand why I think even these fourth industrial revolution technologies will not help much in reducing inequality. The third keyword is US-China rivalry. The rivalry was already there before the pandemic, but through this pandemic, this rivalry is getting more conspicuous, not least because COVID-19 started in China. And with the new administration in the United States, I think the way they compete, the way they settle their disputes would not be as confrontational as during President Trump's days, but still the nature of this rivalry, this competition will have to go on for quite a while. The fourth keyword is globalism as opposed to nationalism. If you think about it, in this globalized world, what we need is unity and cooperation among nations. We have more global problems, so we need global unity and global cooperation. That's very natural. It doesn't take rocket science to understand that. But what we are witnessing in real world is almost the other way around. Countries are, instead of joining force, countries are blaming each other. Countries are fighting each other. So that's kind of frustrating, as you witness during President Trump's time. For example, he always insisted that policy called America First, and there have been some rise of nationalism in Europe as well. So it's kind of not easy to understand why nations, instead of working together, instead of going for unity, why they continue to fight or even fight more in the age of globalization. But that's one important feature of a post-pandemic world, I think. The last keyword I want to suggest is kind of confrontation between state-centered approach and people-centered or society-centered approach. Before the pandemic, in this globalized world, it's not just government who are exchanging with other countries, who are working with other countries, but non-governmental sectors like civil society, like private sector, corporate sector, all of them were already very active in working beyond borders, across borders. So sometimes we thought we are getting into a borderless world. But all of a sudden, with the COVID-19 pandemic, countries are controlling their borders. You cannot travel to other countries freely anymore. So the role of government is coming back and is getting strengthened. So the question is, after the end of pandemic, will we go back to the world where government control is weak and non-governmental players are moving around, working around freely? That would be a big question as well. The impact of COVID-19 is very negative on all the SDGs, all the 17 SDGs. Well, you can say that there are some SDGs that are less affected. For example, SDG on energy, because due to the pandemic, people are not using much of energy. So temporarily, that might look like, helping. But other than these few, there are all negative impacts on SDGs from the pandemic crisis. So under the circumstances, what can youth do to contribute to global sustainable development in the post-pandemic era? That's my final question. And I want to give you these questions for your consideration. I don't want to read them. You can read it for yourselves. And as I said, there are many important global challenges, global problems that are created by globalization or exacerbated by globalization. So we need to deal with them, and one single country cannot deal with such global issues, global problems. So we need cooperation and unity among nations in dealing with these problems. So what is required is what is called global citizenship. People in the world living in different countries, it's time for them to think of themselves as a global citizen in addition to being a national citizen. So global citizenship is about being open-minded. We are often, sometimes even naturally, close-minded, especially under the difficult circumstances like the pandemic crisis. We just think about ourselves, and the term we, us, is very limited. When you think about us, we only think about my family, or my community, or my fellow countrymen. But if you really think about it, who are we? Who are us? We are humans. So that's how the new identification of ourselves as global citizen is necessary. It is about expanding our identity. When we are a child, we identify ourselves with our family, with our community, with our country, with our nation. But it's time for all of us to identify ourselves as global citizens, because we all live on this planet together at this point of time with so many global challenges to deal with. So if we are not able to expand our identity so that we can think of ourselves as global citizens, it would be very difficult for our next generation to cope with so serious global challenges. So two pillars of global citizenship are universal values and respect for diversity. Universal values meaning all the people in the world, regardless of their nationality, of their religion, of their ethnicity, of their culture, as long as they are human, they must have something common. So we call them universal values. Like hope, we want to make our future better than today. Like prosperity, we want to improve our life. Development. Peace, we want to live in peace rather than fighting, rather than risking our lives. So these are all common universal values. Other than these universal values, we need to respect differences. We need to respect diversity. Some people must be different from me because they live in different culture. They have different religion. So let's identify universal values that are common to all humanity, and other than them, let's respect diversity. That is the key concept of global citizenship, and you can see how it is reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals as well. You know, if you read paragraph 8 of the Declaration in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it says, we envisage a world of universal respect for human rights and human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination. So these are all universal values, and of respect for race, ethnicity, and cultural diversity.
Thank you for your good lecture. In some cases, by the development for the better world, including fourth industrial development, there can be negative side effects such as inequality at the rural areas under the anarchy in the real world. So do you think these negative effects can be overcome or can be exchanged to the better ones by sustainable development? If so, why do you think like that?
Actually, reducing inequality is a key issue when you think about development. You know, earlier in my lecture, I gave you the example of someone having 100 chickens while his or her neighbor has only 10 chickens. You need to give yourself a question about why someone has 100 chickens and someone else has only 10 chickens. So our efforts for development, in a way, narrow down to the efforts to narrow this gap, to reduce inequality. Because if nobody has 100 chickens and everyone has only 10 chickens, you know, it's not easy to understand what development means. Well, development might mean that everyone can have more chickens. But the problem in real world is that there is this gap, you know, from long time ago. Gap between rich and poor, gap between haves and have-nots. So we try to narrow this gap. So that is the way I suggest to you to think about development. And in reality, we do a lot of development cooperation, which means rich countries help poor countries. So there is a great deal of development assistance in the form of ODA, which is of course good. But in pursuing development cooperation, we also need to think about the effectiveness of development cooperation and how we can achieve development, especially for developing countries, through various ways, including ODA, Official Development Assistance.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive lecture. Throughout your lecture, you emphasized that COVID-19 has exacerbated global inequality. It has brought about more nationalism, and the US and China rivalry has also become worse. So my question is, how can we foster cooperation and unity on the ground? How can we change the threat perception that people have when it comes to globalization and the loss of individual cultural identity?
You know, under crisis situation, usually people tend to think about themselves first. So they become more selfish, you can say, because a lot of people become desperate. But becoming selfish is not a way of getting out of the trouble, if you think about it. You know, especially when you are under crisis, you need to work together with others, even though you seem to think that, you know, I have to take care of myself first. So it's not easy, but in the long run, as I explained in my lecture, in the long run, if our next generation, young people, can think about the whole planet, think about the whole world, rather than you know, thinking about their own community and their own country only. So if they become global citizens, that would be desirable in the long run. But in the short run, when countries are competing, countries are becoming more nationalistic, it's not easy. So we cannot be optimistic. But when we look at what is happening in the United States, you know, President Trump was very much nationalistic, but he was driven out by election. And we hope the new president, President Biden, as he promised, would be more forthcoming on working with other countries and multilateral cooperation.